Good morning. Hope everyone's having a great day so far, hanging out together in your MCs or at the house or wherever you are watching this. I hope you're having a great morning. It's beginning to feel a little bit like spring, which is awesome. Man, a week from today, we're going to be getting together for Palm Sunday, April 2nd and April 9th. We're going to be getting together as family worship, all of our MCs collaborating and gathering together at the Dublin Lions Club. Again, around 9:15, we'll have coffee. We'll have some prayer if you want to come early and join us in prayer, and then we'll kick things off around 10 o'clock. And so next week is going to be special because we're also having some baptisms at the end of our time together. So we're going to have the potluck, but we're also going to be celebrating 5 or 6 baptisms at this point next Sunday. So it's going to be an awesome time of celebrating and then eating together, singing together. I also want to share this if you have not heard yet. We're continuing to experiment with all the kids that keep coming, which is an awesome thing. And so starting next week, we're going to we've got some adults that have agreed to get background checked, and they're gonna invite any of the kids 5 and under to go into a back room. We'll have some stuff planned for them there just for the teaching time. So that would give parents around 30-ish, 40 minutes to be able to dial in and listen and learn and worship, as well as letting your kids go and be with other kids and hear some stories and things like that. So it's a constant experiment, but it's an awesome thing to get to experiment with is all the kids that continue to come in, especially in our family worship gatherings. So last week we kind of pumped the brakes a little bit, did something a little differently. We're going to do something a little differently today because, well, that's just how I roll. And because we've been leading up to this passage in Luke called the Transfiguration, which is this weird scene that's happening up on the mountain, I really just felt led to stop and really try to challenge and encourage us to seek God, to seek the glory of God, to seek the face of God, to pursue Jesus as a follower of Him. And so last week, we just asked some questions. And really, they were intended to be thought provoking and really self assessing and profound from an individual perspective and a communal perspective for who do you say Jesus is? Like, literally. And then what does it mean to deny yourself? Like, what have you ever sacrificed really to follow Jesus? What does picking up your cross daily really look like? And to really try to evaluate those things, because it can be so easy to just kind of go about our day-to-day business and never really even consider Jesus unless we need him, unless there's a storm in our life or something like that. And so to really talk about that from an individual perspective among your MC, and then we looked at it from a communal perspective to ask questions of like, why are you here? Like, why? What do you think the purpose of this gathering is? And do you view these people as literal family members? Because Jesus did. And so to just have some good, honest conversations about what that looks like and the purpose of being there, because following Jesus would mean that these things matter. And so that's why we want to kind of pump the brakes and ask these questions and just kind of evaluate why we are here and who we say Jesus to be. And so in terms of accountability here, how many of you have not thought about these things since last Sunday? How many of you had like maybe a so-so conversation, or maybe it didn't meet your needs, or maybe you had a great conversation, whatever it looked like, but you really haven't even thought about it since you left last Sunday? Uh, or how many of you have taken up that challenge to be praying for one another daily, praying for the people within your MC consistently, praying for a personal desperation for God, to seek the things of Jesus? How many of you have really done that? Because I get it, life happens, and there is some reality in the midst of things. There's also some excuses. There's also yeah, I mean, it could be anywhere from like great things that like, man, it just got caught up and I just lost track of time to, and Jesus really isn't Lord of my life, and so I haven't really talked. So again, it's not meant to be begrudge or belittle, be condescending or condemning by any means, but it is intended to stop and think about where I really am in my walk of faith. I know part of my spiritual journey, my story is I grew up in the church. I've heard these things all my life. I went to Bible college. I ended up dropping out of Bible college. I ended up rebelling, just full on rebelling from the Lord. And then a friend of mine who I was rebelling with ended up like going to some college Bible study in Radford, and I'm sitting there with him in this campus house, and the guy's talking about Hebrews 5, and it's this kind of sobering passage where the author of Hebrews is saying, hey, man, you ought to be on spiritual meat right now, but you're still on spiritual milk. Like you're not craving the deeper things of God. You're still on these little like morsels or the milk of things. Like, and my friend looks over at me in the midst of this conversation in this college study. He's like, this is kind of like you, man. You grew up in the church. Like, why aren't you craving meat? And it was like this, man, slap in the face from a guy who the Lord was stirring in at that time. But it was part of the journey for me, for the Lord to wake me up and to draw me to repentance and confession, to really try to begin pursuing Him. And so, man, if this conversation, if these conversations over the next couple of weeks, like stir your affections to begin pursuing Jesus truly as Lord and Savior, then goodness, man, that's an answered prayer. And so, I get it. There is reality, but at the same time, is Jesus Lord of your life? And so, if not, how can we help come around you to pray for you and with you, so that begins happening, so that you begin pursuing Jesus. So, anyway, this week, similar approach to things. May not be what you expect, but that's okay. You look at Acts 2:42 and you see the rhythms of the early church, and they devoted themselves, right, to the Bible. They devoted themselves to learning the Bible. They devoted themselves to life together in community, family. They devoted themselves to eating, right, which includes meals around the table. It includes the Lord's Supper. It includes eating together because incredible conversations happen around the table. And then it includes praying together. And so we're going to do that today. But here's the deal. I want to, again, trying to lay some groundwork in for the next couple of Sundays, and to prepare you contextually, because we're gonna get deep next Sunday, and it's gonna be Old Testament, New Testament, and a lot of history and a lot of like symbolism, and hopefully it will all come together over the next couple of weeks. But today is gonna help further lay some groundwork to prep your hearts and minds for what's coming, and again to help stir your heart for seeking God. And so I've got an Old Testament passage that I'm going to ask you guys to read in just a little bit, and then do Discovery Bible Study as you unpack that, and just ask questions and share thoughts. Like, and before you get into that passage, pray for the Holy Spirit to just awaken your mind for new ideas and new thoughts and new perspectives as you guys discuss that passage together. And then when you're done with that passage, I have a couple of short videos by the Bible Project that will hopefully provide some more context, history, depth of things, so you get a better picture maybe of who God is, of who Jesus is, why it matters. And feel free to pause the video after the Bible projects and discuss those things. And maybe new things you never heard, maybe hesitations or questions or fears or whatever that come about. Talk about those things, and then when you're done, come around the Lord's Supper together, pray together, and just begin really over the next couple of weeks intentionally committing to seeking after the face and the glory of God. And that's really going to be it today. So for the passage, I'd like for you guys, when we're done here, you can pause this video because I'm going to try to stretch it all out into one big thing, so you can just pause it. But I'd like for you to read Exodus 33, starting at verse 18. 33:18. You're going to read through Exodus 34:10. So it's I don't know, 15, 20 verses ish, and just discuss kind of what is happening within that passage and that scene with Moses and this pursuit of seeking the face of God. So read that. You spend some time doing Discovery Bible Study through that, and then when you're ready, unpause the video. We'll watch a video from Bible Project, pause it, discuss it. You can watch the second video, and then we'll be done. And then after that second video from the Bible Project, pray together, spend some time praying together, and then come around the Lord's Supper, Lord's table together to experience the Lord's Supper. And I really just, I hope you have fun pursuing Jesus. It should be fun. The life of following Jesus is not easy. I get that, but it also should be fun as we grow deeper in our knowledge of Him and pursue Him in more consistent, meat-pursuing ways to fall deeper in love with Him and each other along the way. So I love you guys. Have a great day and a great week, and we'll see you soon.
If you could go back to the city of Jerusalem during Bible times, the biggest thing you'd see is the temple.
This beautiful building was designed by King David and built by King Solomon, and they believed that it was the home of the God of the universe.
Wait, I thought God's home was in heaven.
Well, the whole point of this earthly temple is that it's the place that overlaps with God's heavenly home. The temple is where God lives and rules all creation as king.
That's cool, but even Solomon, who built the temple, didn't believe that it could contain the God of the universe, right?
Yeah, the building was just a symbol, and it pointed to the fact that all of creation is God's temple. And that's actually what the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1, is all about.
Really? It says that creation is God's temple?
Well, it doesn't need to say it. The whole story shows it. In Genesis 1, God creates an ordered world out of a dark wasteland by speaking in a series of 7 days. Then on the 7th day, God's presence fills creation as He takes up His rest and rule. Similarly, the tabernacle and later the temple were built and dedicated in a series of 7 speeches in 7 days, after which the priest or king could rest and rule in God's presence.
So all of creation is where God intends to dwell. It's like His temple.
Exactly. Now, turn the page to Genesis 2 and we get another portrait of creation. This one focuses in on the land. And in the center of the land is a region called Eden, which in Hebrew means delight.
And in the middle of delight, God plants a garden in which God and humanity live together.
And that's why the temple was modeled after the garden, filled with imagery of gold and flowers. The menorah symbolized the tree of life. It's the place where God dwells with His people.
Oh, got it.
And check this out. In the temple, the Israelite priests and Levites were to work and to keep the temple in God's presence. This is exactly the job description given to humanity in the Garden of Eden.
So these humans were the first priests. But instead of ruling with God, they wanted to rule on their own terms, and they're exiled from the garden temple.
And like Adam and Eve, Israel's leaders also wanted to rule on their own terms, and they too were exiled.
The temple was destroyed, and this left them wondering, did God give up on Israel? Will God bring about a new creation?
Well, the biblical prophets anticipated the day when God would create a new temple with a new priesthood. That's when God's presence would fill all of creation.
And when the Israelites returned to the land, they did rebuild the temple.
But that temple didn't turn out the way the prophets hoped. In fact, later Israelite prophets said that this temple was hopelessly corrupt.
So they're still waiting for the ultimate temple.
And here we come to the story of Jesus. He said that through Him, God's presence and rule was coming into our world in a new way. And He presented Himself as a new kind of priest.
But Jesus wasn't a priest, and He didn't work in the temple.
Right. Jesus said that God's presence, His rest and rule, was filling the world through His own life, death, and resurrection. Jesus was claiming that he was the true temple, and this new temple would expand out to include all of creation.
That's a really big claim.
And it got even bigger. After his resurrection, Jesus said that God's presence would come to dwell in and among his followers so that they would become mini temples.
Communities of people where God rests and rules.
Exactly. This is the Bible's vision of the church, which is described as a temple.
Not a building, but people.
Yeah, like when Peter says, "You all are living stones built up as a temple for God's Spirit to dwell."
So, at the end of the story, do we ever get a new physical temple?
Well, not exactly. What we see is a renewed cosmic temple, just like Genesis 1. And this new creation doesn't need a temple building because through Jesus, all creation is now the place where God rests and rules the world with his people.
Book of Exodus tells the story of ancient Israel being rescued from slavery. And when people say the Exodus story, those are the chapters they're referring to.
But the book has a second half where Moses gives the 10 Commandments to Israel along with these instructions about building a sacred tent.
And what links these two halves together is this crucial story. The people of Israel, they're out in the middle of nowhere. They find themselves at the foot of this mountain called Sinai. And here, God's presence comes dramatically down in the form of a violent storm cloud.
Now let's stop a second and talk about this concept of God's presence because it's really important for the rest of the book. At the beginning of the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, humanity was in God's presence. They had this close relationship with him and it was good. But humanity rebels and the relationship is fractured and access to God's presence is lost. But God promised Abraham that he would restore his blessing to all of the nations, and that includes this restoration of relationship and access to God's presence.
So here at Sinai, God's presence is now right here in front of them, and it's actually quite frightening. And he's here to invite Israel into this unique and close relationship with him.
And the word used to describe this relationship is covenant. It's like a legal agreement between God and Israel. And it's unique because up till now, God hasn't asked Israel to do anything in return, just to trust him. But here on this mountain, God is going to ask Israel to do something. A lot of things, actually. He gives them a whole set of laws. It includes the 10 Commandments. And if they obey these commandments, they will become the people who will represent God to the nations of the world.
Like a priest would.
Yeah, in fact, that's what God calls them to become, a kingdom of priests. And this is all connected back to the promise to Abraham that his family would become a blessing to the nations.
Okay, but obeying these laws is going to be difficult because there's a lot of them, and they set a really high standard.
Though if you think about it, I mean, of anybody in the world who should be able to do it, I mean, it's these people who experienced firsthand God's grace and his power when he rescued them from slavery.
And they agree to obey the terms, but then they refuse to go into God's presence because it's still a bit frightening.
And since the people won't go up, Moses goes up to the mountain by himself to meet with God. But God still wants to be with all of his people. And so he says, okay, if the people won't come up here to me, I'll come down off this mountain to be with you all. And that's why he orders Moses to build this elaborate tent as a place where God's presence can be among his people.
And that's why the next thing we get is 7 chapters of extremely detailed architectural blueprints for this tent. It's really, really long.
But every detail is important and has some kind of symbolic value. For example, there's all this Garden of Eden imagery inside the tent. And it's to remind you that when you're in the tent, you are in God's presence.
Then we get another 6 chapters describing how they built the tent, which is really just repeating the same blueprints word for word.
Now let's back up, because before the tent is finished, there's this super important story. Moses is coming off the mountain with the 10 Commandments and the blueprints in his hands, and he finds Israel breaking the first 2 commands of the covenant.
Don't have any other gods before me, and don't worship idol statues.
Right, and so here we are, immediately after agreeing to the covenant, they're throwing this ritual party, they're worshiping an idol. And so God says to Moses, you know what, this is not going to work. I should just wipe these people out and start over with you.
But Moses reminds God of his promise to Abraham and pleads with God to spare them, which is a really weird conversation. Why would God need to be reminded of something?
Yeah, it does seem odd, but this dialogue is inviting us into God's experience of grief and pain due to Israel's actions. And he really could walk away. But instead, this God chooses faithfulness to his own promises, even though he knows it's going to cost him.
So we come to the end of the book. The tabernacle's built, God's presence comes down off the mountain to fill it, and in the final scene, Moses goes to enter the tabernacle to be in God's presence.
But he can't. He's actually not able to go inside, and that's how the book ends.
Why can't he go in? That was the whole point.
So when Israel worshiped the golden calf, it was like a slap in the face to God's faithfulness. And so Moses can't just waltz into the tent like everything's just fine. There's a deeper problem still in this relationship.
Will they ever be able to fix the relationship and go into God's presence?
Well, that's what the next book, Leviticus, is all about.